My name is David Pascal. I am VP of Sales for CalcuQuote. CalcuQuote is a quote management system for the EMS industry. We work with high mix, low to medium contract manufacturers in EMS, helping them understand their costs and estimating those costs when they get RFQs from customers, then adding markup, publishing quotes, and sending them back to the customer. And thanks everyone for joining us for today's Scratching the Surface Mount series webinar. Our topic today is pricing for profitability in the EMS business. And the topic will kind of talk about, well, am I leaving money on the table with my customer, or how can I use value-based pricing to improve my bottom line? Now, the person who's going to do the majority of the talking today is Chintan Sutaria. He's our president here at CalcuQuote. Chintan has a lifelong EMS background. His family owned a contract manufacturer in the Dallas area, which they sold. And in addition to that, he was at one time working for a Big Four consulting, two of the Big Four consulting companies, working primarily in the manufacturing sector. And then started CalcuQuote because he saw the quote process as being kind of a deficiency in the EMS space. And we've been able to validate that with over 50 customers here in the United States. And with that, I'm going to let Chintan talk a little bit more to everybody about value-based pricing at EMS. Chintan?
All right. Thank you very much, David, for the very kind introduction. And yeah, very excited to be here. And thank you, everybody, for joining as well. Looks like we've got a good-sized group. And so we're just going to jump right into things here. I guess what I want to open with is what inspired this topic. So the topic of pricing for profitability or value-based pricing is one that is very near and dear to most of our customers, and we hear about it all the time because pricing is a challenge in this industry, right? Most people are trying to get better margins and things like that. So, I'd like to put up this slide here to show you some of the things we hear pretty consistently from our customer base. So, I increased my price and didn't lose any business. And what's notable about that is you're surprised, right? You don't know what your price point is supposed to be. You don't know what your customers value your services at. So that's one of the things that we hear very often. The other one is my customer told me that my competitor is much cheaper than me. Again, very valid point to make. But I guess what is familiar to most people about that is that you encounter that situation a lot. But I guess what stands out to us and what prompted this webinar here is that that's used as almost an absolute statement to say, well, they must be able to win more business than me if they're cheaper, without consideration of value or something like that. And then the third one, which is probably the most common one that we hear, is, when evaluating a potential opportunity, someone only thinking in terms of dollars and cents of, well, if I go down on price, I think we're going to win this contract. So, thinking that, hey, I have to go below my cost or right up against my baseline cost to be able to win business. And, these are just some of the examples. In general, I would say, just over the course of interacting with more than 50 EMS companies across North America, one of the things that we hear overall is that pricing is an area of great uncertainty for most people. And so the way that uncertainty breaks down is both in terms of not knowing what the profit on a particular job will be, which I'm sure a lot of you that are on this call can also relate to, but also in terms of not knowing what your price point should be, or what is the appropriate price. And because that second question gets too difficult to answer, most people end up defaulting themselves into the position of how can I afford to go lower, or how low can I afford to go with my price. So what I'd like to do next is talk to you about how price is related to value. So this is kind of the premise that I want to set up here, is that most customers that you interact with, while price is definitely something that they're not going to ignore, they're usually looking at it from the perspective or the frame of mind of value, right? So if cost was the only consideration, then every single person in the world would be going primarily overseas, I would assume, to get the lowest price without any consideration for value, turn time, quality, that kind of thing. And just saying, okay, I want to get bids all over the place, and whatever's the lowest is what I'm going to go with. But that's typically not true. Most people want along with a competitive price, they want value. It's about value, and most buyers get that. So the more value you have to offer, typically the more you end up charging, especially in a cost plus model where you're saying, okay, to deliver value, it costs me something, and so I need to charge a little bit more than that. And that's what this graph here kind of represents. Is as the value goes up, typically your price goes up along with it, right? So, and there's a narrow band, and it's becoming increasingly narrower, where if you were going to charge for something, you basically want to figure out where you sit on the spectrum and charge right above that red region and right below the green region to make sure that you can continue to win business without losing money. So we're going to get into this soon here. I did mention a term here, cost plus, and value in general. What that's going to relate to is something we're going to get into in a second here, is identifying the distinction between that cost plus model and the value-based model. But before that, what I want to do is also scope what we're going to talk about. So let's look at, this is kind of the next phase of just us defining what we're going to talk about today. So what this represents is, in terms of company value, most people think of profitability in terms of company value. And, there's a lot of different levers you can pull to achieve better company value, right? Whether it's revenue growth, cost reduction, improved utilization of your assets. There's a lot of different things you can do to increase your company's value. Well, just for today's purposes, we are going to focus on revenue growth. And then within revenue growth, there's also a lot of different levers you can pull. So for example, you can increase sales volume, and that can look like chasing down new customers, or that can look like growing your existing customer base by selling them additional services or more of the same services. The second part of that, though, the revenue growth, is pricing. And if you can improve your price realization, so be more, more specific about how you target pricing, then what you can do with that is you can actually start to increase revenue without necessarily incurring the cost of customer acquisition, basically. So that's why we're focusing on pricing. It's really, I would say, if you can get it right, it's the most effective way to contribute to your profit margins without adding to your costs. So with that, the final point I want to make in terms of just the scope of today's conversation is we are looking at pricing strategies. So, a lot of times we'll get asked what's the industry standard in terms of how much I should charge for SMT components, placement, or something like that. That's very tactical, it's very narrow, and it's very process oriented. What we're going to focus on for today's webinar is the strategy of pricing. So, the distinction I draw here is a strategy is much broader. It's more forward looking. So you're kind of defining the direction that your company is going to go rather than how you're going to execute it. So if I was going to use an analogy, a strategy is basically telling you where you're going to go towards, whereas the process is how you're going to get there and what rules you're going to follow to get there. So talking about pricing strategy, I think there's a bunch of things that you have to consider. And if you were going to take some action items away from this, this I think is really the big high level thinking that you would want to engage in with your, whether it's with other executives at your company, or whether it's with the ownership, or whether it's with your finance team or your marketing team, whoever is involved in making pricing decisions and pricing strategy decisions in particular, definitely need to address these questions, right? So I'll kind of start at the top and work my way down. So what is your value proposition is something that's extremely important, because you don't want to be a company that's just a me too kind of company, right? So you want to find out what is the value that you're delivering to customers. So it could be that you deliver PCB assemblies with good quality and on time. It could be that you deliver something else, but basically there's something that you offer that's valuable that your customers are willing to pay you for. The second question, that's a really overarching high-level question, is what is your market share goal? So there are companies out there that are, nice family-run businesses that are perfectly content with their existing customer base and their existing revenues, and they have no intention of gaining market share. They want to maintain what they've got. And there's others that are, exploding with growth, and they want to grow even faster. So the question you want to ask yourself here is, what is your market share growth? And if you want to get into a little bit more detail on that, which specific markets do you want to grow in or maintain in? The third one is, what is your price floor? And this is really just valuable because you want to make sure that you're not using a pricing strategy that you can't feasibly achieve given the overhead that you currently have, right? So for example, if you have a really high price floor just because your operational expenses are so high, then I wouldn't recommend trying to be an economy price point when you're selling, because it's not going to be sustainable. You're going to end up losing money or losing a lot of business because you can't be competitive in that area. The fourth question here is, what is your customer's price elasticity? And that's really just a fancy way of saying how sensitive are your customers to changes in price. So if you lower the price, do you end up getting 10 new customers? If you increase the price, do you end up losing 10 customers? Then they're very price elastic. But if you have, and that would apply for something like consumer goods, electronics, or something like that. But if you get into, let's say, aerospace or medical, high tech, that kind of stuff, then there's a lot less price elasticity there. So your customers are willing to stick with you even if prices change, because they understand they're paying for a premium service here. And then finally, the point to consider here is what are your brand? So what are you trying to position yourself as in the market? Are you trying to be a particular type of company that is going after engineers that don't have a huge budget, or are you trying to go and you're going after makers, and so that's how you're positioning your brand? Or are you one that goes after enterprise level customers and large volume production, that kind of thing? So your brand definitely matters here as well. Okay, so now let's get into the meat of it. So what are the pricing strategies that are available out there? So the, it, at its most fundamental level, breaks down into 4 quadrants that you see here. So there is price that you see along the left-hand side and value along the bottom. And so the 4 quadrants basically represent a combination of the price and the value that you offer. So I'm going to start with skimming, because that's one we're going to brush over, because it doesn't really apply to EMS. Whether you do PCB assembly or cable assembly, it's really hard to use a skimming strategy. So what skimming says is you start off with a high price point and then you lower it after time when others enter the marketplace. An example of this would be if you think of Blu-ray players, right? Blu-ray DVD players, when they first came out, cost close to $1,000 sometimes, and they were really expensive. Today, you can buy the same models of Blu-ray players, potentially even better, but they're much cheaper. And the reason they could charge more upfront is because they were first to market with it. It was a new product introduction. EMS in general, what we see is that it is a very mature industry. You're not likely to have a completely new type of product come out where you can charge a high premium and then lower it over time. So skimming doesn't really apply as much. We'll move to the top left here, which is a low price and a low value proposition. So that would be considered economy pricing strategy. Economy pricing, in a non-EMS example would be Spirit Airlines, where it's no frills airlines, no frills flying, you just get to your destination. But in EMS world, a parallel example would be something where you're just saying, hey, if you can give me a clean BOM and tell me how many pieces you want, we'll turn it around in the most efficient way possible. That might mean that we consolidate your orders with others, or that might mean that you have to work on our timeline. You're not going to get a dedicated customer service rep, that kind of thing. So economy pricing is one that does apply to EMS. The next one I'll move over to the top right is low price, high value. And what that's called is penetration pricing. So obviously, you can't consistently have the lowest price and the highest value. That's just not sustainable over a long period of time, because if that was the case, then over time, the prices would go up or everybody else would get to the same price. But penetration pricing, a parallel example, non-EMS would be, if you think of your cable company, they start off by giving you free HBO and stars and premium channels, and then over time, they start to charge you more for it, right? So basically what they're doing is earning your trust to grow your business later. Similarly, in EMS, a lot of companies engage in this pricing strategy where they'll start off by saying, okay, you know what, you're a new customer, we're going to give you some discounted pricing so we can prove ourselves to you. And then over time, we will bring you back into a profit margin range that we can live with. So that would be considered penetration pricing, where you're basically trying to steal market share. And then finally, the premium pricing strategy is high price, high value. So you're basically saying, I offer a lot of value, I think you see that, and I charge accordingly. It is a sustainable, penetration is, it changes over time, skimming changes over time. Economy and premium both are pretty consistent in that you wouldn't necessarily be fluctuating prices dramatically just because your pricing strategy changes there. Okay. So let's go on to the next one. We've got pricing methodologies. So pricing methodologies apply to pricing strategies, and this is what I had touched on earlier, basically cost-based pricing versus value-based pricing. So in terms of pricing methodologies, the reason I called these two out, while there are others, so there is, for example, demand-based pricing, which you know, the most common example that you could think of is Uber, where they have surge pricing when there's more demand. These are the two we're going to look at because they really apply more towards the EMS industry. So in cost-based pricing, it's a lot simpler because the formula for it is fairly consistent. It is, what are your costs and how do you mark that up? And that's what you're going to sell it for. What's also simpler about it is you don't have to really dig into who the customer is in that particular case. You just say, okay, regardless of who comes in the door, this is my price for my services, right? So if I charge, you know, just using an example, if I charge $50 an hour to do SMT, then that's what I charge regardless of who the customer is and regardless of what they're valuing. And then finally, it has this effect of commoditizing your service. So because you're treating all your customers the same, likely if you continue to use cost-based pricing, then your customers start to treat you the same as well, right? So they'll start to compare you hand in hand with other competitors on price because it becomes commoditized. There's really no distinction between you and your competitors at that point. Now, value-based pricing is much more complex than that, right? So what value-based pricing offers is, while you do have to consider what your baseline costs are, it's that cost floor that I talked about on the previous slide. But beyond that, you also have to compare to the alternative, right? So basically, if you're coming up with a price and you figure out what your price point is, what you basically say is, for similar services, what is available in the marketplace today? And then what you do is you find out what differentiates you from the marketplace today and what that's valued at, and you charge a premium for that differential. So the way you can do that is you have segmented customer bases. Again, it's a little bit more complex because you're not treating all customers the same. What you're doing is you're saying some customers are different than others. So if I have a customer coming in and asking for something to be delivered by tomorrow, that customer is different to me than somebody who says, I can have this anytime in the next 3 months, and that's okay with me. So you start to treat customers differently and charge differently for that. So your cost model would fluctuate, or your pricing model rather would fluctuate. And then finally, you start to emphasize differentiated services. So rather than just saying we're a PCB assembly shop or we're a wire harness and cable assembly shop, instead you start to say we are a PCB assembly shop that specializes in 1 week turnaround, or we specialize in long-term production runs at an efficient price, or something like that. Okay, so let's get into, we talked a little bit about value-based pricing, and before we get into this, actually, the other thing I want to emphasize is value-based pricing basically says at its most fundamental level that we're going to charge our pricing based on what the customer values. It's not going to be a reflection of our costs. It's going to be a reflection of what the value is to our end customer. So with that, implementing value-based pricing starts with the customer. So the first thing that you would do is you would segment your customers, and you can segment along a variety of dimensions. The most common ones we see by default in this industry are by industry or by the size of the customer, or maybe by geography, right? So you have the Western region and the Southeast region and the Northeast region and so on. Those really fall into place by default, just by convention is what we find in most cases. There's really no attribution of value to those, right? So for example, if you're segmenting by industry, you know, a common example I use is if you're doing industrial equipment assemblies and HVAC systems. There's really, I mean, at the end of the day, you're building PCB assemblies for both of those, right? There might be some specialization you can have in there, but really not a whole lot of distinction. But if you throw aerospace and defense in there, well, now you have a differentiator between that segment that's pretty substantial, which is the aerospace defense company might require you to have AS9100. They might value that you have minority certification. They might value that you have certain processes in place to track materials through lot codes and things like that. So that's when industry starts to matter. same thing with size of the customer, right? The larger the organization, the more requirements they're going to have in terms of continuity plans and in terms of quality audits, things like that, whereas a smaller customer is really going to be more interested in maybe even just getting the prototype put together so that you can take it to a trade show or something. So segmenting customers is very important here. The next thing I'll get into here is comparing with alternatives. So this is really important in terms of determining value-based pricing because you don't know what the value you have to offer is until you compare yourself with the alternative, right? And what's important here is the alternative is not an internally focused process, it's an externally focused process. What I mean by that is, let's say tomorrow you start tomorrow you get the AS9100 certification, right? And you go to your aerospace and defense customers and you say, hey, now I have this certification, that's what makes me different. Well, it's different from yesterday, that's true, but if everybody else in the region that you work within already had that certification, it's not a differentiator for you. There's really, you're comparing yourself to an alternative where you are now equal to everybody else, right? So it's not a positive differentiator there, and you do want to compare yourself to an external alternative, what the customer could get somewhere else, basically. The third thing is understanding your differentiation. So the question here is, what makes your offering different? So this could be in the form of certifications, fast return times, better quality, or dedicated program managers, whatever it may be, but you need to understand what that differentiation is and make sure that that differentiation is in fact correct and that it is a positive differentiation. So both very important steps to understand that. And then understanding also goes beyond just understanding it within your executive team. So you have to understand it throughout your organization. So whether it's your sales and marketing team that needs to know how to message that appropriately, or your operations that needs to know this is how we need to meet this pricing strategy. So for example, if I have a dedicated program manager, you need to talk to your program management team to make sure that they have the resources to be able to support a dedicated program manager per account. And then finally, valuing the differentiation. So this is where you get to ask the question of, hey, what's it worth to you, right? So you can go to your customer and you can say, this is what I offer that's different, and I know that you value that because we've talked about it, and this is how much I'm willing to charge. Now, this is a trial and error kind of process, right? So you will have to be very scientific in how you approach that in terms of assessing what's the price point that you can charge to have that differentiation. Because if you just throw a number against the wall, you might still be leaving money on the table, or you might be scaring your customers off. So very important to look at what the value of that differentiation is. You continue to iterate upon that and make it better over time so that you're getting down to how much can you charge to capture the full value of the services that you offer. So we talked a little bit about how to implement it. Now I'm going to get into the considerations of value-based pricing. So when you are implementing value-based pricing, one of the things you want to look at is understanding your competitor's pricing strategy. So the simplest example I can think of here is if your competitor is using a penetration pricing model, right? So they're using penetration pricing to steal market share, and you're trying to differentiate with your value-based pricing. Well, if a product were to cost $100, all things being equal, and your differentiation allows you to charge $50 extra, well, if your competitor starts charging with the penetration pricing strategy and only charges $25 for that same thing, well, now all of a sudden the customer isn't looking at an extra $50 to get the value you're offering. They're looking at an extra $125 to get that value. And now all of a sudden it starts to feel really expensive to them. So make sure you understand what your competitor's pricing strategy is. The second thing about that, though, is that you don't want to misjudge your competitors in terms of what they include with their pricing. So, every once in a while, you'll get a customer that says, hey, you came in too high by $50, or you came in lower than your competition. They'll give you hints of that feedback, but you might not have all the details worked out, right? So you might not know that your competitors are also offering, dedicated program managers, or your competitors are offering 5-week turns instead of the 2-week turn that you're offering. So it's very important to be abreast of what is going on in your marketplace. The second consideration here is clarifying the value proposition. So you don't want to misjudge the customer segment here, right? So you don't want to assume that they value something that they don't, and that's really important to clarify. So as an example, if you think that having the latest equipment is really important and you start charging for that, you might find that the customers in your region or the customers that you're going after don't really care about how new your equipment is. They don't really care about how fast it places parts on a PCB, right? So you want to make sure that you're clarifying what your value proposition is in terms of what your customers value, not in terms of what you invested in it. Third point here is segmenting customers appropriately. So this is really important because not only because you want to match your value proposition to the customer segment, but also in terms of leaving money on the table. So if I inappropriately group customers, then what that does is it says there's going to be some customers within that segment that are scared off by the pricing and others that were willing to pay more. So make sure that when you're going into this detailed analysis of customer segments that you're really looking at, does this customer belong within this segment, or do they need to be split out separately? Okay, and then the final point here is to stick to your strengths. So one of the biggest mistakes that, in general, from a corporate strategy perspective that you can make is trying to do what's called straddling. So you try to be both the premium value provider and the low cost leader. You can do that as a penetration pricing strategy, but eventually that's going to catch up with you if you don't correct it, right? So that's why I said earlier on that quadrant, the penetration pricing model is unsustainable over a long period of time. You do eventually have to capture that back. So what I would say is you really have to pick your strengths here and say, are you going to be offering a premium service or are you going to be offering an economy service eventually, right? Okay. We talked about some of the considerations. Now let's talk about some of the benefits that come with value-based pricing. And this is going to kind of close us out here. So in terms of benefits of what comes with value-based pricing, the first one is, and this is really the reason that a lot of people do it, is it separates your costs from your profits. So if you're using a general cost plus market pricing model, then what ends up happening is as your revenue goes up, your cost goes up, and your profit stays about the same in terms of margin. So all you can hope for is volume, right? What value-based pricing does is it says it's okay to turn down certain business opportunities because overall your profits are going to go up. So maybe your revenue doesn't necessarily go up, but your profits go up, and it decouples the costs from the profits. A simple example of that here, real world example is Apple, right? It costs them a couple $100s at most to make and distribute the iPhone, but they can get away with charging, $700, $800, $900 for it because they've discovered the value-based pricing model here. Okay. The second point here is value-based pricing encourages innovation. So once you discover that differentiator within your company, once you start to see that profit margin go up, it really energizes the whole company to think in terms of innovation. So if you discover, for example, that a 5-day turn time can allow you to charge substantially more because that's something that's valued in the market, then it starts to get everybody in line and around this very clear message of how can we reduce our turn time to maintain that differentiation. And so it continues to feed itself also, right? So basically a little bit of success in value-based pricing turns around and encourages innovation to continue down that differentiation path. So the third point here is clear brand identity. So, one of the things that we see from some of our customers is they'll say, well, my win rate is 10% or 20%, and I don't know why. I don't know what I'm doing wrong. Well, part of it is that because they're not using this value-based pricing model and they're just treating all of their customers the same, what ends up happening is that they don't have a very clear brand identity. So anybody walking in off the street says, I want a quote, and they're providing a quote to, and they're trying to be competitive on all quotes. Well, you can't win it all, right? So you want to have a clear brand identity. It's great if you can go back to your customers and say, here's what I'm good at. So when you have business that aligns with this, come to me. And then finally, this kind of aligns with the brand identity is that it creates distance from your competition. So you don't want your customers to be comparing you apples to apples with the guy down the street that also does the same thing that you do. Instead, you want to differentiate yourself somehow. You want to give your customer a reason to pick you other than just who is the lowest price, because that just gets down a very bad path of low profit margins. So if you can use value-based pricing, you can really pinpoint what makes a customer choose you and continue to go after that. And that way become known for providing that specific niche thing. Okay. That's it in terms of value-based pricing. What I'll close with is it's really important to consider that value-based pricing is not a one-stop solution, right? It does pair with other strategic initiatives. You'd have other strategic conversations that you would need to have, and making sure that you're still competitive in terms of your cost model and things like that. So, it's not a it's not a one-step solution for anything. What I will say is it does have a lot of potential, and when executed appropriately, we see a lot of our customers that I would consider industry leading to execute it really well to improve their win ratio and improve their bottom line. With that, I'll pass it back to David to let us close out.
Thanks so much, Chintan. And thanks to all of our attendees today for joining us for this webinar about value-based pricing in the EMS industry. If you have any more questions about value-based pricing in EMS, don't hesitate to reach out to one of us. You can see our phone numbers at the bottom of the screen, as are my email address and Chintan's email address on the screen as well. Or if you're interested in talking about your quote process and ways to improve your quote process, how to come up with consistent cost estimates so that you can focus on what's my value and what should I charge customers appropriately so that I'm profitable. CalcuQuote can help with that as well, and we'd love to learn more about your business and talk to you about improving your quote process via CalcuQuote. So thanks everyone for your time. We will send out a recording of this after the call. And again, if you have any more questions about anything we've talked about today, don't hesitate to contact us. Thank you.